Have you ever wondered what makes a place special? What gives it that special characteristic, that grace, that elegance that makes you want to go back there? For me, islands are special. And in this short talk on perspectives of a Nisomaniac, lovers of Ireland, I want to share some of these ideas with you. This is my own village of South Golson in the northwest of the Isle of Lewis. And when you look at the islands of the north and west of Scotland without the great landmass of Scotland and Europe to the east, you can see this massive archipelago that stretches off hundreds of miles with hundreds and hundreds of islands, which was once the centre of the universe to many of the people who lived there and travelled through these lands. This is the centre of the universe for me. This is the middle of the village, South Galson, where I stay. To give you some understanding of where it's placed, if you look at the map of the UK, and in the top left-hand corner is Lewis, and in the top left-hand corner of Lewis is the area of Golson. Many villages are similar to this throughout the north and west, but this one has special characteristics that I want to share because it might make you think about what makes life special for you in those different areas, what makes it unique. I began by thinking, where was the geology of the Lewisian first? Where was the geology we stood on, the rock we walk across, the Lewisian gneiss? It goes back some 3,500 million years. It was formed probably 25, 35 kilometers deep in the crust in a region similar to the root zone of the Himalayas today. And when it was formed, it was down south near the South Pole, and then it drifted slowly northwards over the millennia to where we have now. So one of the first changing things about the changing Outer Hebrides is it wasn't always where it is now. Change is natural, and it's how we cope with change that distinguishes different places and different people. This is an interesting area because just at the south of the village, there's an area called Preveg. And Preveg was once thought to be the area where the ice sheet stopped, because further north of this, there are soft sands and gravels that would have been scraped off by the ice moving past this area. But in this area, south of this line, all these sands and gravels of raised beaches have disappeared, but north of the area, they're still preserved. I'll come to that later on. This is a view from my house, looking out across the bay towards this area. And this saddle in the middle ground is quite important for the geology of the whole of the west coast of Scotland for this period in geological time, because it mixes in boulder clay, till, and peat, organic material, in different layers as the sea level rose and fell over the successive advances and retreats of the ice. And this is still to be investigated in some detail. But what we see now is not what was there 1,000, 10,000, 10 million, 100 million years ago. Before I get onto the details, I'm just looking at some of the things that are quite common in the different areas. So for example, about 800 BC, 1000 BC, we had Iron Age settlements living here. And these layers of shells within the sand, within the gravels on the shore, are actually indicative of where they ate food and threw away the shells in big rubbish piles. And we can see boulders poking out of the sand where these are the foundations of various buildings. There's been earth houses found here. There have been storerooms and so on. So there's a whole layer of successive civilizations that have passed through this area and left their mark and moved on. The Golson earth house was quite interesting. It had several rooms in it. It's all collapsed into the shore now as the coastal erosion removes the sands and gravels, and it tumbles into the shore. But there was this long lined passage underground, several rooms, and then nearby there were probably several storerooms, souterrains, underground houses, which were used in collaboration with the underground houses. The slightly further away from here, 50 yards or so, there's the half of a roundhouse, which has collapsed into the sea with boulders still prodding out from the grasslands. This is an example of a souterrain, an earth house that was found in Knockhaird a couple of years ago when we were clearing a site for a house. You can see this marvellous brickwork. It's almost perfect in its layers. Probably connected with a passage to the other houses or other storehouses, and then used and covered up for future, for posterity. There are several of them in the area, so it's unusual we find one as well preserved as this, but they're not uncommon. In this area of the Iron Age midden, we find lots of pottery shards washed up even today. And what's quite interesting is that the pottery styles can tell us something about the age of its formation, although this is remarkably consistent for a long period of time. And perhaps counterintuitively, the earlier pieces of pottery were much more elaborate than the later pieces. But we can see a piece in the centre here where someone's pressed some like a ring into the soft pottery. Above that, we see this sort of ribbed decoration around the edge of the pot. Down on the bottom left, you can see how the coils of clay have been wound around to build up the pot. And at the top, we can see more of these coils. In the top left, you can see the indentations left by somebody's nail in the soft clay as they've decorated this. And these have remained buried in the soil, where they're getting washed up now as the sands and gravels move. But they have been consistently made from local clay over perhaps thousands of years. Broken, thrown away, discarded, but still telling us a story about the history of this particular place. This is not the only thing that have been found of interest within this archaeological site, within these midden areas. We have bits of worked antler that have been made into picks or maybe shafts or various implements. There's a whalebone weaving comb that was found at one point, bone needle in several cases. And this brooch, this harness mount, which we see in the centre here, bronze inlaid with enamel, which is quite interesting and quite unique. It would be worn on a horse's halter as a harness. If we go back to areas of archaeological importance in the surrounding area, we have Tobervrige, St Bridget's Well, which is still flowing sweet water, clear water in Melbourne. This was the site of a healing well where people would travel from all over parts of Scotland and further afield because it was rumoured to be a cure for jaundice. Nearby to this, there's a small chapel, two-celled chapel, dedicated to St Bridget, who was the patron saint of midwives and newborn children. And they're nearby, and there's a sort of indentation in the ground where you might see the sort of shadows of the foundations in a certain light, which is rumoured to be the foundations of a nunnery dedicated to St Bridget, which was quite common in those days. A healing well, a chapel, a convent side by side. Moving on, still BC, and we're looking at the remains of Dune, a broch. These are quite enigmatic structures on the horizon. Of course, there are many ruined brochs throughout the north and west. Were they defensive sites? Were they lookout towers because they quite often overlook the sea? Were they living quarters? Perhaps, but they lack access to fresh water quite often. Were they just mansion houses for big and powerful families, or places they retreated to in times of siege? It's difficult to know now. But from this site, you can see 4, 5 other brochs, 5 other dunes in different parts of the horizon. So it seems to be more common on that early horizon, early event horizon, than is thought now. This one is pretty ruinous, and what we're looking at is probably the level of the ceiling of the first floor. There's still more below ground. So there's still quite a lot to discover in these areas. Looking across the village, looking down towards the sea, there's the toe in the sort of the centre of the right horizon, where the glacial toe is mixed with the peat. This area here, looking down over these crofts, there is the remains of a Norse village here. It's quite interesting because it doesn't have any defensive fortifications that we can see unless they've been lost. So it suggests that the Norse have been here long enough to feel secure. They've settled down. They're farmers. They're traders. They're married in with local community and settling down here. And so this is a common story throughout the north and west. The area sort of moves from these Iron Age settlements, settled by people that we don't know really where they came from, what language they spoke. It's quite lost in the depths of history, moving in through the Gaels, moving in through the Norse, different levels of civilization settling in these areas and claiming that land, renaming that land, settling that land, developing, breaking down, ruins, falling, wars, intermarriages, and then moving on. So it's quite a complex history. This was also found by myself, in fact, on the shore about 30 years ago. It's a brawn harness mount for a horse harness, and it's inlaid with red and green enamel. It's so old, it's been buried in the sand, it's devitrified, but you can still see in the corners fragments of the early coloration, red and green little bits. This is quite unique origin. There've only been 3 found. Two, one in a Viking grave, Isle of Man, one from a Viking grave in Norway, and this one. There's a slight pigmentation in the chemistry of the glass, which is not there to colour the glass. Copper makes things go blue, etc. But this is not for that purpose. It was just an impurity. And when we look at that impurity, then that is found in at least one of the other brooches. So there's a possibility that these 3 harness mounts were actually made in the same workshop. And this is evidence of the great trade route from the west coast of Norway down through the islands, Isle of Man, which really let the Norse stretch from their homelands in the west of Norway through to Iceland, to Greenland, to North America, and then down the other way through to France, down through Spain, Mediterranean, even into the Black Sea. They were huge sea travellers. This was not a remote area. This was not the back of beyond. This sea route here was a motorway. It was the M1 of its day. It was an area where people actually travelled back and forward and spread the news and bartered and traded. People moved up, tried their luck somewhere else. It was a busy area. If we're looking at, the west of Ireland was, for many hundreds of years, it was the centre of culture in Europe. It wasn't on the periphery. It was the place to go if you wanted to see ancient manuscripts, if you wanted to find culture and hear music. It was the place to go rather than travelling over land was quite difficult because it required roads, and roads weren't developed to the full state yet. So you either rode or you walked because there was no wheeled vehicle that would travel many of these places. But if you had a boat, it was easy to go anywhere. You could travel, you could sail between the islands. Islands weren't remote places. They were a locus. They were the nodes by which people travelled. They were the interconnecting spots by people which travelled, which was the centre of their journeys, not the edge. Looking at the map of this place, I wanted to know what was the earliest map that mentioned Golson. And the Blue Atlas, 1654, one of the earliest atlases of Scotland, although this was mapped by Timothy Pont years earlier, it gives us an unusual feature because it has the islands left to right rather than up and down. But in the top right-hand corner of the map, we have the Butt of Lewis, and we have Dell mentioned, we have Borv mentioned, and a place in between that, which seems to be, although it hasn't got the name Galson, it's called Gaisted, which seems to be the locality based there where Galson was. So this is the first time it actually appears on a map to our knowledge as a settled community. The difficulty of building these maps was quite considerable because they didn't have satellite technology. It was all based looking at triangulation of resources, which is an early way to try and map this area in relative to other parts of the area that you could see. But in collecting names, we're looking at very early names, which were perhaps taken on by Gaelic speakers and given a Gaelic pronunciation, which were then either renamed or put into phonetic speak by Norse. These names were collected by people who spoke English but didn't speak Gaelic, and therefore there was perhaps an error in collecting some of these. These were put into Scots, then published in the Netherlands by people who spoke Dutch, who didn't speak English necessarily or Gaelic. So in the process of doing so, some of these names have been either lost or bastardized and changed around, so that it's quite difficult sometimes to actually locate the different places. But Golson is a named place even back then. If we then look at Murtagh Mackenzie's map, these were maps made by the Arcadian Murtagh Mackenzie, who was asked by the government to make maps of the north and west shortly after the Jacobite rebellions, because they wanted to know what sort of land they had acquired, where were the enemy based, where were they travelling, how to get around the place for armed forces to put down insurrection. And if we look at this, then we can see North Golson and South Golson mentioned quite clearly in its place. So this is really the first time that they're mentioned in their present day English names and correctly located on a map. Murtagh Mackenzie made some excellent maps. It's quite perplexing how he made the maps with such accuracy these days, given the limitations of the knowledge in those times. And in between the North and South Golson, you can see the old chapel is mentioned even then. So the chapel we'll come to in a second. It's probably built on a site of an ancient pre-Christian site, but has been there for literally hundreds and hundreds of years. This is the chapel that was captured in the prints by William Daniel. So William Daniel in the early 1800s took a tour around the whole of the coast of the UK, painting as he went. He painted half a dozen paintings in the Outer Hebrides, and he produced a book in several volumes where he described his travels and he showed the paintings and he sold that to make money. And this Chapel Macroneuve, Chapel of the Holy Cross, Chapel of the Holy Blood, the name is quite enigmatic. But you can see it was unroofed and ruinous even then in 1819. What's interesting for me is this slight hill on the right-hand side, the two figures on the horizon. William Daniel was known for the accuracy of his paintings and meticulous detail he put on. So this suggests that there was significantly more land on the seaward side of the temple than there is now. The people for scale would show that there's at least 100 meters there of shore, where now there's barely 10 or 20. This is ruinous even then. It was used for celebrations. It was used for communions and etc. Over the time. The old graveyard is still there, but the old house, the old foundations rather of the chapel are still at ground level because the thing has been ruinous over the years. This is a view of it. The old chapel is just behind the building in the centre, towards the seaward side of that. And you can see these other buildings are relatively new, and the more modern graveyard is off to the right. This is on the raised beach plain at Lewis, stretching along the coast between Borv and Dell. And people went there, like they did here, to Taksang in Bhutan. They went to places that were as remote as that because they wanted to get away from the world. They wanted to get away from the temptations of the flesh, and early Christian missionaries settled this area. They travelled on, they spread the gospel, but they also spread writing, they spread ideas, they spread culture. If we fast forward, the next map we have that shows you the place in detail, there are the early Ordnance Survey maps. The 1853 map that was printed in 1855 shows you the village of South Golson in a different location to where it is at present. You can see the farmhouse is the small circle that was there, but the village itself, though the crofting settlement, was off straggling the area between North and South Golson in a roughly northeast southwest direction. And you can see that those little squares that indicate houses are filled in. They're black and they're dark at this point. And there's nothing towards the left half of the screen because that area had been cleared for the farm. The farm was largely covering South Golson, but also into surrounding areas. If we then look at the next map that was made in the same area, just shortly after 1895, we have the same struggle of houses in North Golson there, but you see all the houses, all the rectangles are now white because in between Golson was cleared. 1863, it was the final clearance when people were removed forcibly and sent away either to surrounding villages or overseas. And all that remained really was the farmhouse, which is still there, and a couple of shepherds' cottages, but none of these houses that were there. So for the first time in perhaps thousands of years, the valley of Golson was unsettled apart from the farmhouse itself. There was no community that was based there. We can still see the remains of some of these pre-clearance houses along in between the road and the shore in North Golson, struggling around there, down by the shore. And some of those houses were rumoured to have hidden rooms built into the framework of these very, very thick walls to allow people to actually hide from the press gang as they came around. What we do have throughout the village, there's probably 5, maybe 6 of the corn drying of the Norse mills and the corn drying kilns. This is the one from Shawbus. This is what it would have looked like. The plan here, photograph of the plan. You can see where the fire is lit in the top left right hand corner. The hot air goes up the flue, and on the platform itself, in that dome, that bowl there, is where the grain was dried, spread out and dried, and when it was dried, it was gathered and then taken to be milled. This is quite a big one, just on the edge of the village and on the common grazing area, which might suggest it belonged to the farm. It was quite bigger rather than the village itself. There would have been several throughout the village, but the kilns like this were built quite some distance away from where the settlement was because of the risk of fire and the risk of fire burning the thatched roof of the houses. This is the ruins of it now. You can see the flue right in the foreground, leading up to that hollow in the centre there, where the grain was actually spread and dried. So although the walls have collapsed and the roof has fallen in, we can still see the foundations of this, indicating its pedigree going back probably certainly for several hundreds of years. If we come forward there to 1921, areas like Galson were quite hotbed of activity in the latter part of the 1800s because people were overcrowded. There was poverty, there was hunger. Although some people moved away to other countries, to Canada, States, Australia, and so on, there was still quite a lot of poverty and hunger, and there was a land hunger. People wanted land that they could grow crops to feed their families. And this was denied by the landowners at that particular time, although the increasing pressure after the First World War meant that some areas were actually raided by villagers. They came here and they squatted, they pulled down the walls, they threatened to turn the cattle and the sheep of the farmers loose on the moor. And the pressure encouraged government then to buy back this area, not on the ownership of the land, but buy back the area under crofting tenure and create these 55 separate crofts. So this is the map that actually indicates the creation of those crofts, which on the area in the top centre there, which was largely with the farm, the fields of the farm and surrounding areas round about. So the idea of breaking these into separate units was so that different families could establish there and grow some food, have some cattle, have some sheep, and practice subsistence farming along with other activities. And this is the map that actually captures that and puts that into perspective. Our croft is in the middle of this village here. From that day of settlement. What happened was that the people who wanted crofts in the area, or even indeed further away from Glasgow, or there was one person came back from Canada, if they wanted crofts, they would put their name into the hat, and the government drew a lottery, and then the lucky winners were actually allocated parts of the different areas of croft land for the. They had to come and build the house because nothing was there. They had to go and build a house before they could live here and begin to work the land. So it was quite a difficult period in time. This is a more recent view, looking down here, but you can see these long linear strips of land. Potatoes, grass for hay, grass for pasture, maybe some root crops like some potatoes and turnips and so on for cattle fodder. But all of these houses have appeared since 1921. None of this was there at the time. So we now have a village that went from a bustling village in the early 1800s through to a cleared village in the turn of the century, in the late 1800s, 1890. We've been only the farmer and his family here. And then after the 1924 resettlement of people coming in here, we had 55 families here with all the children they had at that particular time, spreading off, sometimes building one or more houses on the croft to accommodate the families that are there. So our views of sustainability and our views of the history of that time change rapidly with different flash periods of time. And what we see now isn't always what was always there, what was always had been. Likewise, the vegetation. I mean, this is an orchid. This is an area that's quite famous for a variety of different orchids and plants. They have come in here, passing migrants, things like dunlin come here. There's a variety of birds which would be considered rare in other parts of the world, other parts of the country, which are quite common here because of the closeness of the environment, because of the space where the birds can breed. And what it suggests to me is like the story of The Other Landscape by Neil Gunn, where people can look at a landscape and see things behind the landscape that are intangible assets that aren't necessarily obvious to casual view. And so Gunn describes it like meeting two people, one after the other. And the same thing happens with both persons, but he knows he likes the first person, he doesn't like the second person because he's seen something different behind that person, perhaps in their character, perhaps in their attitude, perhaps in the way they said what they said, although they said the same thing. And some people can look at the landscape in that as well, and they see areas where it's good for them for wildlife. They see areas where they remember historical events taking place. There's a history which gives it a special character which is significant to them, like a fingerprint, like something that is actually they've grown up with or they've learned about the place, which they feel more than actually necessarily see in reality. This is one of my favourite maps because this actually shows that variety of the diversity across the area of Golson. This is the shaded area. And so the area, in the largest area in sort of light green, is the common grazing. It's the moorland area. It's heather, it's wild Molinia grass, and so on. Some bits of blue that are improved areas, improved grassland that's been fenced off and reseeded with sand to reduce the acidity, and then seed to actually create fields. The red area is the area of the in-by land, the crofts themselves, which were used of individually laterally fenced off. Initially, it was just one big open area, and the animals were in for the winter and out beyond the fence for the summer. But now it's broken into individual fenced areas, fenced crofts, fields, and so on that are used for growing individual crops and livestock. So there's a whole variety that are mixed in here, but also there are things that you don't see. The places that people used to go to gather grass for thatch where they went to gather berries, they went to gather shellfish off the shore, where they went to get heather to make ropes to tie together for tying down the thatch and so on, where they go to cut peats. Even yet, many people will cut peat to burn as domestic fuel. So there are areas that are known for certain families to go to certain places, or for particular items in the area, which is, to me, is quite similar to the idea of North American Indians that Hugh Brody talked about in Maps and Dreams, where there was a physical map, but there was also the mental map of the history of where families went to trap and to gather berries and to gather food at certain times of the year, which is known within the family. But as a casual visitor, an outsider, you wouldn't necessarily know these things just by first glance. And I think some people have the ability to capture this. This is a local artist, All Safety, who I think had the ability to capture in just a few brushstrokes and splashes of paint the amazing insight into place, that capture views. This is one particular cottage that we have, which is an area that is art, yes, but it also tinges that upon that hidden landscape and capturing the spirit of a place more than just the detail of a place. This is the village now. It comes through looking towards the moor in the horizon. This is about half of the village of South Golson here, and you can see all of these houses that have been developed over the course of the mid and late 20th century. So we've gone through discussing about sustainability. Sustainability depends on what you're measuring and when you measure it, and in comparison with what. Things that were thought to be sustainable in 1850 are no longer sustainable now. Things that are sustainable now will be looked at with horror in 50, 100 years' time. So the idea of self self-interest, sustainability, growing crops to feed your own family and so on was quite common in that time when supermarkets weren't so prevalent. And it doesn't take very much imagination to think about a time when it is more difficult to move food around and more expensive to move food around different parts of the world due to fossil fuel restrictions, for example, or political unrest, or even things like the volcano throwing ash into the environment a few years ago, to realise that people may then actually return to growing more food for themselves, even though if it's only partially what they would grow. If you combine this with things like the change in working from home that's taken place during the pandemic, for example, there people are actually able to work from home rather than drive to the nearest town or even further afield offshore. Not everyone can do this, but those that can realise that why was I spending 5, 6, 10 hours a week driving back and forward to work when I can do the same thing from home, and perhaps split some time between home and an office somewhere else. So it changes the idea about being able to do things and be able to be remote or be isolated, when in fact you can do exactly the same thing in different places. So it throws up all sorts of philosophical arguments about what is remote, what is isolated. When I look at this moor and I see the richness of wildlife and both plant and animal within this, then I don't see a barren landscape. I see a landscape that's rich in resources, but one you have to look at carefully to understand. If all you see of it is from the road, from your car, and a nice day in the middle of summertime, then you only see a tiny fraction of the potential of this area, as opposed to all the different areas. So when you put all this together, the history, the prehistory, the archaeology, the wildlife, the natural environment, the social history that changes through time as people are come from different societies with different priorities and different cultural background, different language even in many cases, it creates a unique mix, almost like a DNA of the different village. And it's this combination, I think, that makes a place special. Certain aspects of that speak to you and suggest to you that this is some place that you can find some elegance in the environment, some beauty, and rather than being somewhere that is on the edge of things, actually this is the center of things, and it's only the places that are far away, the big cities of London, of New York, that are actually remote from where you're thinking. Remoteness is something that you can do, play games with. And if you look at this in terms of remoteness to the distance to travel to a population of a city with 50,000 people, then the map looks very different. India has shrunk because of this huge population. Western Europe is shrunk because of its large population. But areas like Greenland, for example, are massively out of proportion because it takes a long time to travel to a city with 50,000 people or more. So you can play around with some of these ideas, but I quite like the idea of the Norse travelling up and down the west coast seaboard as a main line of communication, which was actually so much more valuable and so much more rich in cosmopolitanism, internationalism, and trade than adjacent areas of the mainland, because it was so much harder to travel around on land at that particular time. This presentation, you can see that again if you want to skim through that on my SlideShare site, and you can email any questions you can send by email to me if you like. So thank you for watching. This is all tied together in a book that I've been working on recently. It's due to be published in November 2020 by Acker and Stornoway, which is called The Changing Outer Hebrides, Golson and the Meaning of Place. Thank you for listening.